with a quick capsule. Okay, I deny everything I've said up to this point. Uh, uh, a quick capsule of how we got here in terms of where the reform movement is, and then to identify trends in current Reform Judaism in America, and then based on those trends, try to suggest where it might end up being in 25 or 50 years. Of course, we know that in antiquity, the rabbis warned that prophecy was given to fools. So I really don't want to prophesy or prognosticate even as much as I just want to identify strong current trends that are reshaping the nature of the movement itself. Um, Reform Judaism um, is a little more than 200 years old, so it's not new to the game. In fact, it's about the same age as the Hasidic movement in Judaism, although they really represent polar opposites in how Judaism has encountered modernity. If you're interested in diving deep into the weeds, the best book is Response to Modernity by Michael Meyer. Really, anything that Michael Myers writes about this topic is the best. But there are lots of other people involved, depending on how much you want to spend with this topic. And it's also, I got to say, a little bit dangerous to talk about it because we're all living it, and we all come from our own point of view, our own experiences, and see different things. There are regional differences. There's sub-regional differences. There's differences here in Philadelphia between where you are in the main line. I assume most of you are somewhere in the main line, and where I lived in Elkins Park for 20 some years, and what's going on in Center City. And if you would use any one of them as typical, you might come up with a very different scenario. So it's a bit problematic, but absolutely necessary. Just as in quote any business, you have to have some sense of where you're going so you know where you put your chips. So in terms of a quick run through on the history of reform to understand exactly where we are as a movement, it Reform Judaism is not a simple thing, even though most of us can function in a Reform synagogue in a very natural way. There are many different cultural and philosophical pieces that are at work here, and some gears are meshing, and some gears are being pulled out of the transmission box, and other new ones are being put in. So it is a complex scenario, depending on your age. If you want to go back 30 or 40 years, think about how different reform was um, then in our young adulthood or even our childhood. I remember growing up in Baltimore, being in synagogue a lot like KI, where I served. It was old, it was formal. We had ushers that wore boutonnieres. We got all dressed up every single time. There was no lazy Friday involved. The sukkah was indoors. We stood when the clergy entered, and they were in full regalia with robes and pillboxes. We used the Union Prayer Book. It was kind of interesting in that stage of reform. The bigger the synagogue, the smaller the prayer book. Today, the smaller the synagogue, the bigger the prayer book. So things have changed very, very rapidly, and they're changing. They're changing right now. It's shifting sands all over the place. Um, where reform begins, in my opinion, is during the Enlightenment in the 18th century, with the proposition that human beings are endowed with reason, and that reason, rationality, is universal. Prior to that, the assumption was um, Jews were different than other people, that this is before the development of race theory, but that somehow as a people or a nation or a tribe, we were different. And most of all, we were not educable. There were actually essays written in England and Germany as to whether or not a Jew could be educated to be a Western person, or a Jew, no matter what you did to him or her, would remain a Jew. It was a theoretical question, and it was unimaginable to most people on the other side that Jews could acculturate to the point where they could function as both Europeans and as Jews. It was an either or choice. And where it came down in much of the Enlightenment, but not all of it, is that Jews were educable. That if you sent a Jewish kid to, let's say, a consistoire a school in France, that they would come out as French citizens of the Jewish faith persuasion, that they were fully educable. But there were others who said, this is not so. Later, there was a rejection of that during the Romantic period in Europe. Remember, the United States only had a tiny Jewish population, 2,500 at the Revolution, 10,000 the War of 1815, whereas Europe had millions. So the question in Europe was a tremendous one. The second question after rationality was, if Jews indeed are educable, can they be brought into society as citizens? And the whole concept of citizen as we know it is modern. I know we had it in ancient Greece, but then it disappears. You have kingdoms. Jews, everybody in a kingdom is a subject of the realm, and they really don't have the concept of citizenship. That's introduced by the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and others, where the feudal system is broken up. In the feudal system, the Jews are outside of society. They live in a given place. They can live in a place for 1,000 years, but they're not part of society. They're not subjects of the realm. They're a special case. They would be something like Native Americans on a reservation. They're highly controlled in terms of where they can live, their economic activity, even permission to marry by the government. And this is overthrown by revolutions, which then have to argue whether or not Jews can become citizens. At first, there's great progress on this issue. And then I would say after 1815 and the resurgence of anti-Semitism, it started going the wrong way. When things started going the wrong way, and we're now early in the 19th century, that is the point, in my opinion, where Reform Judaism begins, because it wants to keep the gains made during the Enlightenment. It wants to keep the gains made during the end of the before the end of the Napoleonic era. And in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, part of the deal is that any state or any principality can determine, based on previous practice, the status of Jews in that realm. And it basically went against the Jews, and it left them with basically the option of assimilating and converting, or remaining as these alien creatures outside of society. The first attempt at reform took place in Germany, a part of Germany that was controlled by the French because of Napoleon, in the town of Sazen, which is south of Hanover, if you know your North German geography. And there he built his temple, Israel Jacobson, um, with the idea that he could demonstrate that Jews could be Frenchmen, that Jews could be Germans um, of the Jewish faith. That has tremendous consequences inside of the Jewish community, um, that ultimately will lead to the rise of the Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century. The answer to the question about can the Jews be Frenchmen at the beginning of the 19th century was yes, of course we can, and we can change our religion to fix it, but then we also have to give up all hopes of national restoration, which is deeply ingrained in the Torah and deeply engraved in Jewish thought, that the purpose of Judaism was to get back to the land of Israel, to reestablish a Jewish kingdom, to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem. And the early reformers said no, that Judaism must adjust to modernity and Jews have to become citizens. And in so doing, they have to acculturate and strip away the appearance of being alien to society. So we're not going to dress differently. We're not going to eat differently. We're not going to speak differently. We're going to be like everybody else, but we're asking for a special carve out when it comes to religion. And that was the impulse to reform. I very much like a book written by, it was a dissertation, a conservative rabbi named Alan Silverman. He's in New Jersey, and he called it alternatives to assimilation. And he viewed Reform Judaism, particularly for the upper middle and upper class, as an alternative to assimilation, that the way into society was not to convert to Christianity, but to fix Judaism, to make it more European, or let's call it more modern, so to speak, to change the architecture of the synagogue so that it wasn't kind of a circle with the reader in the middle, but it was more like a church that was linear in a box, that everybody wouldn't be doing their prayers at their own speed, or as Isaac Mara Wise once said, his synagogue was not going to be a fish market, no cacophony, and that we were going to have unison reading, and we would take on other things like, for example, instrumental music to beautify the service, and again, aesthetically put it more in line with Western culture. These initial changes were made by laymen in places like Sazen and Hamburg in particular, which had the first real reform prayer book. It will spread to the United States in the 1820s. What happened was a Unitarian minister read in a German paper about the Reform Temple in Hamburg, translated it into English, and published it in a local newspaper in Charleston. Members of the established colonial Sephardic congregation saw the article in the paper, and a number of young families in particular, almost all of whom were Sephardic and of Portuguese descent, said, "Hey, we want to do that here. That the old regime of the Orthodox Sephardic synagogue really is pretty boring, and our kids aren't interested in it, and we need to We need to fix it, and we don't need so much Hebrew. We got to speak English like Americans. We need hymns. We need to rethink the place of girls in the synagogue. And the reform movement hatches here in America like it does in Germany among the laymen. Um, it's only in the next generation, particularly in the 1830s and 1840s, that rabbis begin to get on board with this idea of reforming Judaism. Initially, it was a layman's movement. It was mostly about the aesthetics of worship. But in the 1830s and 40s, you begin to get a class of rabbis, people who had gone to yeshiva, were grounded in Talmudic study, but also then went to the university and got PhDs in history, philosophy, philology. And they said, we can create an ideology for these reform changes based on deep research and new philosophical thinking. So they presented a whole theory, actually several systems of philosophical models of what Reform Judaism would be like. There were three major conferences in Germany in the 1840s, and Reform now has both lay people driving it from the bottom and rabbis driving it from the top. And one of the odd things is that in this period, the push for radical reform often was more intense from the top than it was from the bottom, although there were exceptions, particularly in the city of Frankfurt and in Germany. Many of these rabbis in Europe, I'll give you one name because he came here to Philadelphia, was David Einhorn, got in a lot of trouble in Europe for their thinking. There was no separation of church and state. Most of the states in Europe at that point were very, very conservative. It was called the Age of Metternich after the Congress of Vienna. It was a diplomat from Austria. And the Reform rabbis tended to be liberal on politics and liberal on religion, and that got them in trouble in Europe. And they basically were thrown out, or they were undermined to the point where it was no longer comfortable to say. The Jewish communities, all the way from Riga in the east to Berlin in the middle of Europe, the Jewish communities also split, and there were very sharp controversies within these communities. So a number of the Reform rabbis bailed and came here to the United States. I don't know if the people who did the movie The Frisco Kid actually did research with Gene Wilder, but it wasn't so wrong in the sense that they wanted to get rid of the troublemaker rabbis in Europe and send them to the United States. So you have all of a sudden a group of immigrant German-speaking rabbis, excuse me, coming to the United States just before the Civil War to introduce both the aesthetic as well as philosophical aspects of Reform Judaism. But it was very, very small. It was very controversial. And the Jewish newspapers were filled with all types of controversy over this. But Reform was tiny. At the moment of the outbreak of the Civil War, there were about 200 synagogues in the United States, 150,000 people, of which 6 were Reform. Only 6. Here in Philadelphia, just one. KIRS didn't turn Reform until the 1890s, and Mainline is an outgrowth of of KI and others that there was some kind of missionary work and seed planting and things of that nature. So you get this transfer of brain power, reform movement. The vast majority of the Jewish immigrants were Orthodox, or at least traditional in their upbringing. They weren't, many were in small business, so there was also some great economic success. And it is until after the Civil War that the reform movement begins to grow in the United States. Some people say it's because of all the casualties of the war, which we, God forbid we ever have anything like that again. There was a spiritualizing effect on religion, and people wanted less ceremony and more, quote, what we call spirituality. Today, and reform begins to grow um, because of the rabbis, because of grassroots interests, and there is a leader who is guiding this uh, growth and trying to turn it into a national trend, and that is Isaac Mayer Wise in Cincinnati. He was of a moderate nature and willing to compromise and keep more pieces of tradition than some of the others. He was opposed within the movement to David Einhorn, who came here in 1855, who said that Reform Judaism needed to stay radical and that the language of reform needed to be German, even here in the United States, so that for much of the 19th century, most Reform synagogues had prayers mostly in German and a little bit in Hebrew. And instead of Hebrew school, they offered German school so that the kids who were born here of the original immigrants could maintain themselves in these German-speaking societies that was Reform Judaism. Wise finally succeeds beginning in 1873 with the creation of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. You all remember the letters UAHC, more recently the URJ, and its primary purpose was to pool money to create a rabbinic school, HUC, in Cincinnati that would train American rabbis who would speak English and be familiar with the culture of the country. And a battle begins between the Germanists and the Americanists and the Reform. And ultimately, what happens is, with respect to ideology, and that German ideology is what becomes known as classical Reform Judaism. So Wise does the American thing and builds organizations, and the Germans control the ideology and the liturgy. Einhorn finally relents in 1879 and allows his prayer book to be translated into English. The prayer book of Isaac Mayer Wise fails. Minhag America, which was a moderate prayer book, probably closer to conservative. By 1892, the rabbis themselves are organized into a denominational setting, the Central Conference, and they put out a union prayer book, which becomes the standard liturgy, which is heavily based on Einhorn's Germanic radical reform teachings and reform. Judaism at the turn of it believes in dropping ceremonies, getting rid of the kippah, getting rid of the tallis, getting rid of the shofar, which they considered to be too primitive a sound. That get rid of reading the Torah, which they considered to be archaic because it was not a rational activity, listening to sounds that you didn't understand. Get rid of bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah hadn't been invented yet, and instead substituted with confirmation, which was based on method. And this was the classic period of Reform Judaism up to the period just before World War I, where you have the rise of the progressive movement, and two things begin to happen at that point that change reform. Um, the first of it is locally in the United States is progressivism, which says that Reform Judaism needs to be involved in social justice. In the 19th century, the idea of prophetic Judaism was mostly personal and ethical. But by the 20th century, in the progressive era, it was societal. So we need to get involved in economic issues and that. And I would say the presidential platform of Woodrow Wilson of 1912 served as a model because they're looking to the rest of society for models for social action in the reform movement. The second huge change in reform was the rise of the Zionist movement, which fundamentally opposed the basic premise of Reform Judaism and said that the Jews, in fact, are a nation, and that if you call yourself a Jew, you're mostly making a political statement. You are stating your nationality. Then you can do whatever you want with your religion, the different choices of religion within Judaism. But Zionism was all about redefining the Jewish experience as a national political experience, and classical reform and Zionism clashed mightily with one another. And in time, what happens, of course, is although there's a lot of opposition, the Zionist ethnic political approach to Judaism wins. The progressive social action remains in place, and Reform Judaism, and particularly in America, begins to change. And it begins to look more like the Reform Judaism that we have today. It led to a revision of the Union Prayer Book, particularly the 1940 revision, which, by the way, was rejected by the original classical reformers as being too traditional and too Zionistic, that they didn't like it, but then later seized on it as kind of their expression of what Reform Judaism was supposed to look like. The Reform movement is very small. At the beginning of World War II, the guess is that there were about 50,000 of them, capacity to build big cathedral-like synagogues, like KI on Broad Street or RS on Broad Street. But it was still a very, very small group of people who were of German origin, but increasingly American of birth. 1940 approximately is the date in which the majority of American Jews are now native born and not immigrants, and the whole German piece begins to disappear from the Reform synagogue. There is a change starting in the late 30s as the Depression eases, suspended by World War II, but then American Jews begin to move out of the cities, begin to move away from the blue-collar class. Most of the East European immigrants were blue-collar workers in factories and sweatshops. Their main organizational affiliation were unions. Their most popular expression of Judaism was theater. And they begin to move into the suburbs. You have less intensive Jewish neighborhoods, and the synagogue becomes, in fact, the Jewish neighborhood in the suburbs. It is strengthened greatly by the Cold War, which says that America is religious and the Russians are godless communists. Many of the Russian immigrants had left during the period of the revolution, and in fact had moved away from religion, uh, only to come back into it because of the culture of the American um, suburbs. And it's in the suburbs that the reform movement really begins to grow as a way, as an alternative, again, to use Silverman's phrase, an alternative to assimilation. Although by 1960, demographers and the popular press is beginning to predict that American Jews are going to completely evaporate in the suburbs because of mixed marriage. They also predicted that as Jews became suburbanites, they would switch from their union based Democratic affiliation in the city and become Republican. Well, they were right on one and wrong on progressive and Democratic experience. Mixed marriage, which starts slow, about 1961% or so, and today is statistically normative. And that's one of the first great changes that reform today is looking at, that sociologically, we are not a tight-knit group of German Jews and their descendants, but we're American-born, and we are becoming increasingly diverse because of mixed marriage. It's had different phases. At one point, typical mixed marriage was probably between Jewish and Italian because there's so many cultural similarities. Irish were particularly resistant to mixed marriage with Jews, and mixed racial wasn't even heard of. So you begin to get this change of mixed marriage, and as the reform movement works on this, it increasingly separates itself from the other streams of Judaism in the United States as the non-Jew finds greater acceptance in the Reform synagogue. Another trend that starts at this time was a radical change in the role of women in the synagogue. Um, in the very first expression of Reform Judaism in the United States in 1826, who wrote poetry and songs and wrote a hymn book for the first Reform congregation. But by and large, women were rather marginal in the life of the Reform movement in this country in the long German period. It's under the influence of the suffrage movement that you begin to see in the 1890s or so, women showing up as teachers inside of the Reform synagogue. Before that, um, Sunday school education was mostly done by the Hebrew Sunday School Society, which had been founded by Rebecca Gratz here in Philadelphia in 1838. It was an all-women's organization, and it was Orthodox in character, and it was not affiliated with synagogues. Reform synagogues in particular started to create their own Sunday schools to compete with the Rebecca Gratz Sunday schools by the end of the 19th century. Succeeded. They were under control of the rabbis and had a reform content to it. And through the schools, women began to infiltrate, let's call it, into the structure of the synagogue, greatly strengthened by the suffrage movement. An attempt to have women ordained as rabbis in the 1920s failed in Cincinnati. The faculty was for it. People say it was the wives of the faculty that were really behind that. But the board said no, and that decision was delayed to the 1970s. It's hard to imagine. I mean, here we are 50 years later, and we're going to approach the point where the majority of Reform Jewish clergy in the United States are women. A woman is not president of a synagogue in this country until the late 1950s. In Great Neck, New York, Norma Levitt, from the Levittown people, which is its own long, difficult, and not so pretty story. But you begin to see women moving into leadership in the reform movement. And very controversial aspect of this, generally rejected by feminists, is a trend that as women move into a field, men move out. So examples of that would be secretaries, because traditionally men were the secretaries, and school teachers, which starts somewhere in the 1830s under some new theories of education about women as being better nurturers than men, and therefore should be the teachers of little children. So women begin to move into the Reform synagogue at a very rapid pace, and men begin to pull away. And today there is quite an imbalance, a gender imbalance in terms of general activity. Men tend to be, well, they're half the rabbis. Still, a number of men are presidents and treasurers of synagogues, but the crowds that show up are generally made up of women. This is nothing new in American religion. Puritan ministers in the 17th century in their diaries complained that the people listening to their sermons were mostly women, and the men who were too tired from their work during the week were not showing up. And you have other examples of that in Virginia and other places as well. So gender becomes a major issue in the reform movement, which has two sides to it, and that is both the increased role of women and the decreased role of men. Prior to, let's say, 1890, the reform movement was almost entirely dominated by men. All the clergy, all of the presidents of the congregations, the boards of trustees, et cetera, men, men, men. Women start to organize themselves in the late 19th century outside of religion. It's the National Council of Jewish Women. They are attached to some synagogues in the Reform movement. And by 1912, 1913, you have the National Federation of Temple Sisterhood, which is more focused on domestic issues than kind of the power control of the synagogue. So you have all these changes taking place, German to English speaking, and men challenging women. Then you have the rise of the suburban lifestyle in Judaism after World War II, automobile culture, where people no longer live within walking distance of the congregation. The first break really on that was the trolley car, and then later the personal family car. It still kept people within 15 to 20 minutes of their place of worship. The suburban lifestyle was about recreation, and it was highly youth oriented, and you begin to get the youth groups. Starts in 1939, the Jewish summer camps, which began in the 1950s. And in many ways, one of the things that has happened in the early 21st century in Judaism is kids were sent to camp in part to become members of temples. And in time, what happened was the temples started to began to look more like the summer camps. I'm always accused of making up words, but there was a kind of campification of Reform Judaism, where camp-style music and informal dress and peer-based experience was more important than the liturgy and the power structure of the congregation. So you get a youth culture. That youth culture was very susceptible in the 60s, first to the civil rights movement, then to the Vietnam War, then to the third resurgence, third wave of feminism. And there is a complete cultural revolution within Reform Judaism, within Judaism in America. It leaves the modern branches of Judaism, including modern Orthodox, conservative, and Reform, I should say Reconstructionist, greatly weakened because the attachment of the kids to institutions is weakened, and they have to fight their way back in the 1970s, trying to incorporate aspects of this new counterculture in Reform Judaism, the new aspects of counterculture into Reform Judaism. So, for example, I got married in 1977. I didn't have a ketubah because it was considered archaic, and it was a legal expression of Judaism, which was rejected by the early reformers. But under the counterculture movement, which I call Woodstock Judaism, it was cool to have an artistic ketubah, and nobody cared about the fact that it was actually a legal contract. And they changed the language from legal to poetry in any event. So you had this change based on the counterculture. You also had, of course, the establishment of the State of Israel, which ended the debate over Zionism in the Reform movement. And to me, it is accompanied by a fundamental shift in the ideology of Reform Judaism. And that is the early Reform Judaism of the 19th century was about becoming European, becoming American, and that the religious ideology of Reform Judaism was called ethical monotheism, that there is a God who we worship, who wants us to behave as good people. In the suburbs, under Zionization, again, to make up a word, Judaism mostly becomes ethnic. And you get, instead of ethical monotheism, you get monotheistic ethicism. And ethnicity begins to become more important than one's personal relationship with God. And Jewishness actually is more important than the relationship of the Jew to his or her God. And we're still struggling with trying to find a balance to that. There are countervailing movements, for example, the rise of right-wing religion in the United States, and then from a completely different direction, an interest in Eastern religions, particularly Buddhism, which is a Protestant version of Hinduism, in my opinion, begins to influence reform, and it helps open the back door to mysticism in the reform movement. The reform movement becomes very interested in mysticism. It becomes interested in the Hasidic movement today, that is somewhat tempered, but completely unreconciled with the fact that the Haredi, half of whom are Hasidim, are politically completely against Reform Judaism and abuse it in places like Israel and other societies. But Reform rabbis are still telling Hasidic tales, which makes almost no sense to me, because you're using the cultural content of a culture that's totally opposed to who you are. So you have all these trends coming along. Mixed marriage continues to increase. It leads to Alexander Schindler proposing outreach, to proposing patrilineal descent, and it pushes the reform movement further to the edge of the larger Jewish community, where reform once had dominated things like federation. Now all of a sudden found itself defending a rather radicalized radicalized position, and it wouldn't operate without the benefit of the non-Jew in the midst of the of the synagogue. And then finally, so hopefully we have time for discussion and questions and all of that. Um, by the by the early 21st century, it was clear that technology was going to be changing at least the organization of reform, but actually what it did was change the whole culture. Um, and COVID, of course, was an accelerant here. Um, Technology was invasive, but not to the older generation until COVID. And then there was a very rapid transformation. And people who said they could never operate a cell phone, all of a sudden are operating Apple computers. You get hybrid Judaism, where, like we're today, and I appreciate it because I have my own challenges of meeting entirely on Zoom instead of coming into the house, which changes the function of the synagogue, which has huge ramifications as to how much building you need and all of that. And technology begins to change not just the business environment of the reform movement, which, by the way, was still rooted in the membership model that had developed all the way back in the 1820s and is now it's under review, but nobody can figure out an alternative model to it. And that brings us to this very moment at which the biggest single question that we're all experiencing is that the rising generation, the 30 and under, let's say, certain, even 40 and under, has a different understanding of institutions. They live in a world of cell phones, of instant communication. They are not prone to joining organizations. There was a book by John Putnam called Bowling Alone, whereas in the 50s, very often men's bowling leagues were huge parts of synagogues. Today, they don't exist anymore. If they exist, they're tiny and anemic. And the new generation is not attracted to big box Judaism. And that is what's, I think, causing the biggest worry. I remember being present at Eric Yaffe's swan song as president of the Reform movement, and he talked about his three children, not one of whom had any interest in a Reform synagogue. It was a remarkably honest and painful presentation, but like a lot of the things he writes, it was really on the money. So we are at an inflection point. I would say we are at a crisis point in Reform Judaism. There are areas of great strength. The youth culture that produced the summer camps remains strong, although NIFTY has become generally weak. Recruiting rabbis from the under 30 crowd has become almost impossible. Membership patterns have changed from you get married, you join, and you stay until you're in the grave to I'm going to join when my kids are in third grade, get bar mitzvah, and then leave again at seventh grade. So the lifeline of membership has gotten much shorter, and the percentage of people who join has become smaller because now some people are saying if you want a bar mitzvah, you can simply hire an itinerant rabbi or tutor and pitch a tent in your backyard or go to some hotel and create your own Jewish kind of experience. So reform is facing these challenges. At the same time, we have to be cognizant of the fact that Orthodox Judaism in the United States is growing rapidly by leaps and bounds, mostly due to fertility and the retention of the new generation. In places like Baltimore with large Jewish communities, more than half of all children in Jewish education programs are now in Orthodox programs. Not, it used to be 10% Orthodox. It's moving toward majority Orthodox here in the United States. The Israelis, by and large, if they do any religion, like in Israel, attach themselves to Orthodoxy. A lot of it has to do with the inherent nationalism of Orthodoxy, as well as the high use of Hebrew. And then you have an even larger population of Russian Jews who do not feel attracted to Reform Judaism as being highly Americanistic and very strange culturally from their point of view. Many of them even have decided to only speak Russian at home, and their kids don't learn English until they have to go to school. Um, so the camps stay strong. The largest synagogues with the largest endowments are okay, and the rest of the picture looks pretty bad, in my opinion. The reform movement, and I'll stop with this, has not been honest. Uh, I'm always in a fight over this one about its actual size and rate of success. Reform used to present itself based on affiliation rates. Um, and as such, during the late 20th century, could claim it was growing and becoming the largest movement as conservative Jews who mixed married came over to Reform and moved away from Reform affiliation as a way of counting to Reform identified. And here's the trick. A lot of people in the American Jewish community, if you ask them, if the Pew study asks them, what kind of Jew are you? And they'll say, I'm Reform. So based on that, the Reform movement will claim it's the largest movement in American Judaism with over 2 million people. But then if you ask the next question, and the Pew does not ask this question, where are you affiliated and where do you put your shekels? That number drops dramatically from the millions down to the few hundred thousands and has a downward trend. So we're not self-reporting. I realize there are political and even PR reasons or propagandistic reasons to report the movement as being very large, but in fact, it's based on identification and not affiliation. So affiliation becomes the single biggest challenge I think that the movement is now facing. So let me. I was a mouthful and a half, and I'd like to stop so that there's some time for some comment and general rebuttal.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was incredible and insightful, and you gave us a lot to think about and digest. Certainly, I want to jump back to what you were saying about and please, anybody feel free to jump in here about the Pew study. 37% identified as Reform specifically, 17 identified as conservative, 9% identified as Orthodox, 4% identified with other movements, and 32% said just Jewish.
Right.
So this was in 2020.
The nuns.
So I mean, you have to imagine that the just Jewish number might be quite a bit higher today. That number is probably growing, and the Orthodox number certainly would be growing, the conservative number going down.
So looking at that, it's important to state that just Jewish means they have no institutional or denominational affiliation. And within that group is a group called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not Catholic nuns, but meaning Jews of no religion at all, which is probably the fastest growing sector of American Judaism, particularly among the youngest cohort. It again asks the question identified versus affiliated. So it's a false read. And on the Orthodox, what they're not asking is how many children do you have and what percentage of them are enrolled in Jewish educational programs. So Reform, which was quite large at the end of the 20th century, was bigger in every dimension, but its actual numbers and its structural strength has diminished tremendously overall, but still has some some centers of great strength in it.
Thank you.
Mark has a question.
Yes, hi, it's Marcy.
It's okay. Hi, Marcy.
Hi. Besides endowments, is there anything that some synagogues are doing that has been very successful?
So the obvious model in the American Jewish community, and Philadelphia is a prime example of that, is Chabad. That has dropped the membership model altogether. It is very scary because it actually relies on the rabbi and rebbitzin in their traditional ways as being entrepreneurial. They're motivated by mysticism. They believe their rabbi is the Messiah. They work 24/7, including Shabbos. They don't ask for any money up front, and they conduct their finances as a permanent endowment campaign. So they're no longer using the club model. Here in Philadelphia, in the 20 some years I've been here, 24 Chabad centers have opened up, and there are no new Reform synagogues. In fact, there's mergers going on and compression and sinking. So some business schools actually are studying this question. There was a big study done at Brandeis University. There's this question of the duelist synagogue as to whether or not you can get people to give. It's a modification of the member model, but without structured dues. And then most successful, but based on a very particular profile of its workforce, is the Chabad movement, which emphasizes fundraising over membership as a way to do this. The other big change in the picture is the growth of Jewish family foundations. Jewish family foundations today, I believe, are bigger than Jewish federations. There's a lot of money there, but because of the number of synagogues, they tend not to give to synagogues. And they give to different types of agencies. So the big money out there from federation and family foundations is not headed in the direction of the synagogue. Based on all of that, I would say the synagogue's going to have to become much more aggressive on the fundraising side. Membership is not going to sustain it, and even in places that are super strong, successful, magnetic, like Central Synagogue. I don't know how much money they have in the bank, but I bet it's $100 million. And they're going to be okay. They're going to be okay. The rest of us have an awful lot of work to do.
Just curiosity, if we use the model of a mega church, would he could but be Jewish?
The mega church model was explicitly studied by the Reform national leadership and was used at the level of the biennial, which has now been suspended, which is mind-boggling to me. It was the biennial and the Reform Judaism magazine, I thought, were the two most successful expressions of reform. Both were suspended by national leadership. It was absolutely suicidal. And they studied the big church phenomena, but we could only pull off one big church event every 2 years. And that is because reform is not, as much as we would like it to be, a Shabbat-based community. It's more of a buffet. And generationally and culturally, people pick from the buffet that they want, and then they're not going every week to the same buffet. So it's hard to build reform on the mega model, which is based on Sunday attendance. In a mega church, every Sunday is Yom Kippur. I would also say that, and this is a big issue for me, the way we use the education profile of Reform Judaism is hurting us instead of helping us. Reform Jews, along with people from India and I think Ghana, are the most educated people in the United States. And so much of the reform movement is educated to kids. It's infantilized, it's youth culture, and it does not appeal. It is not necessarily appealing to people who are high level professionals who have terminal degrees. They view it as a lot of kid stuff. They don't dislike it, and they think it's great for their kids, but they don't see that, they don't read themselves into it. So another recommended change, and this is where I've spent a heavy part of my career, and this talk, I guess, is kind of proof of it, is that one, we need to appeal more, we need to be targeting more the most sophisticated, most educated people in our movement, and not being as fixated as we are on the camp experience. Camp experience is great for kids, but it doesn't help you so much when you're 75.
Rabbi Sussman, that was the best concise history of Reform Judaism
I'm
I've
70
ever heard.
going on. Yes.
So
Thank you,
thank
Rabbi.
you for that. Yes.
Coming from you, that's very meaningful. Thank you.
No, thank you. And while I agree that we have issues with pediatric Judaism, I think the complete abandonment, essentially, of the youth culture and the reform movement is producing problems that are far greater, such as we're not getting students to go to rabbinical and cantorial school. We are failing to develop leadership in other arenas, to be able to get us to a place where we can have this sort of high level, sophisticated conversation about the issues, both positive and negative, impacting the movement and where we go from here. And of course, we've had recent events, as you detailed, like COVID and October 7th, that have in very short order shifted the landscape to a certain degree. So what, in your estimation, is the formula for solving all of these concerns?
I think we can't give up on youth culture. It has to remain a very strong part, and it's a part of general society. That's why McDonald's have indoor playgrounds. So you can't, if you want to get customers, you have to do that. But we need to move from 2-star fast food to 3 or 4-star fast food in terms to retain the older generation. If the older generation sees its primary function as getting kids a Jewish education and to essentially produce 12-year-old Jews, will not sustain the movement in the long run. Judaism is a religion for adults. And the goal with the kids is to train them so that it's a lifelong learning, lifelong worshiping kind of experience, and not good times with a peer, only good times with a peer group. As kids, what comes in that interim stage? There's this huge drop off in college, 20s and 30s. The next time young people present themselves is for weddings, and then they're still gone until it's time for preschool. Preschool was a very important gateway to Judaism today for adults. I once gave a talk at the ECE that the preschool is the front door of the synagogue. And the question there becomes, how do you cultivate, and they're very busy people because both parents are working, how do you cultivate them that they see synagogue as essential part of their families for the next 6 decades, as opposed to a service that is done when the children are very, very little. The instinct that little children belong in a Jewish environment is very, very good. But how do you build out from that. And we have something that I call the Great American Jewish Gap. And that's somewhere between 15 and 35, where the rate of affiliation almost hits bottom. And that is very different than in the Orthodox community. If nothing else, they're getting married younger and their kids are in the programs earlier. But we have this huge gap, which creates a disconnect, and we need to fill in that gap for the 20s and 30 somethings. And then how do you hold on to parents, let's say, who really committed and stick it all the way out through confirmation? What do they do then? What's their job and what's their role in the synagogue? So that we have a little more even distribution of participation. Synagogues are very good at the bookends. So the youngest families are highly active, and the newly retired are highly active, and in between, it's a sagging kind of environment. And it will take a lot of creativity.
Thank you, Rabbi. Anybody else?
I think Marcy or Mark has a follow-up. Is that right? Or the hand is still up. The white hand is still up.
Okay, I think they're settled.
No easy answers to this, and I don't want to end negative. There's two ways of looking at the Jewish experience. We're the eternal people, or we are the ever-dying people. And actually, it's the same thing, because you don't disappear. So I don't think that Judaism is going to disappear in America. I think the rising generation is going to find its own way. Maybe synagogues will need to have tattoo parlors with Hebrew calligraphers in the tattoo parlors. They will figure out a way to reconnect with the tradition. I think October 7th in particular, and the rise of anti-Semitism is affecting. We don't know yet what it did. I know what 1967 and the Six-Day War did to me and my generation. I think October 7th, and it's complicated because of Israel's role in Gaza, how that is affecting Jewishness. The leading scholar of American Jewish life is Jonathan Sarna, and he says this is the moment to double down on Jewish education, lifelong Jewish education across the board. And I said to him, we're happy to be friends. He was my teacher, but now we're friends. That's the sermon every rabbi's been giving since Moses. But maybe it's urgent at this point.
Thank you, Rabbi. Well, I think before we conclude today's session, I just want to share about next week's session coming up on February 20th at 12 o'clock. So next week, the special relationship between American Jews and President Teddy Roosevelt, part 3 of this 3-part residency with the wonderful, erudite, learned scholar, Rabbi Lance Sussman. Thank you very much for this wonderful part 2 exploration. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, rabbis.
Take care, everybody.
Okay.
And happy birthday to Susan Kleiman.
Happy birthday.